Today, we're diving into what's called first principles thinking, an approach that sounds philosophical, yet it delivers practical enablers to help teams get things done and move past seemingly unmovable roadblocks. As work grows more complex and interconnected, our ability to strip away assumptions and reconnect with fundamental truths isn't optional. It's a survival skill. When we explore how this mindset connects to systems thinking, why it's essential in AI accelerated environments, we can start applying it right away. I was recently sitting in a meeting where the team spent 2 hours debating how to fix their deployment pipeline. Everyone had suggestions: automation, better testing, source code reviews. And then a new team member who'd been with us just a few weeks, he asked a question, and it stopped everyone cold. They just asked, "Why do we do it this way?" The room went silent, not because it was a silly question, but because nobody could really answer it. The team had been optimizing a process that had been handed down to them for years without questioning whether the process itself made any sense. That's the power of first principles thinking, stripping away inherited complexity to real foundational truths. And as our systems grow more interconnected, as AI amplifies both our capabilities and our mistakes, this way of thinking transforms from interesting philosophy into necessary practice, one that helps avoid yarns of tangled thread that become overwhelming and even dangerous to consider untangling. Let's unpack what first principles thinking really means, how it connects to systems thinking, and most importantly, how you can start using it right away. Let's cut through the buzzwords. First principles thinking means breaking a problem down to the truths that don't rely on assumptions. Those foundational elements that hold up regardless of tradition, tools, or trends. From there, rebuild the solution from the ground up, shaped by what's genuinely needed, not inherited, not presumed. Most of us reason by analogy. We look at how others solve problems and adapt their solutions. That's efficient and often effective. When you're building a web app, you don't reinvent HTTP, you use what works. Analogy helps us move fast, and that's valuable. First principles thinking doesn't reject analogy, it pauses and asks, what are we actually trying to achieve? What constraints are real versus assumed? If we started from scratch, knowing what we know now, what would we build? And would we build it differently? Or would we build it at all? A team I coached a couple years ago was struggling with their testing strategy. They had unit tests, integration tests, end to end tests, smoke tests, regression tests, everything, layers upon layers. New features took weeks to fully test. Everyone agreed it was too slow, yet nobody questioned the fundamental test strategy. During a retrospective, I asked them to apply first principles. Forget everything about your current testing. What are we trying to achieve? After some discussion, they landed on, we want confidence that changes don't break existing functionality for users. So I asked, what's the minimum required for that confidence? The question unlocked everything. They realized most of their testing validated internal behaviors no customer would ever see. They were testing how the code worked, not what it delivered. By focusing on user facing behavior, they cut their test suite by 60% while actually improving confidence. Tests ran faster, feedback was clearer, and the work better aligned with user value. This mindset is deeply aligned with Agile. Working solutions over comprehensive documentation includes testing artifacts. Responding to change over following a plan means questioning the plan when it no longer serves its purpose. First principles thinking brings these values to life by constantly asking, does this still serve our actual goals? Now, that doesn't mean throwing away everything and starting from scratch every time. It means pausing to understand what it truly is important, what's needed, and seeing whether what we have aligns with those needs. Where they align, we keep them. Where they don't, we adapt, rebuild, or discard. Another team, a startup. They spent months building a complex set of microservices based architecture because that's how modern applications are built. They had 12 services for 50 users. It was unsustainable. We walked it back. What problem were microservices solving for them? Scalability? Well, they had 50 users. Team autonomy? Just one team. Deployment independence? They deployed everything together. When we reframed their needs from a first principles perspective, one team, one product, need for rapid iteration, they consolidated into a monolith because the deployment time dropped from hours to minutes. Features delivered much faster. They tripled. And if they ever needed microservices down the road, they'd introduce them for the right reasons. This isn't about being anti testing or anti microservices, it's about being anti assumptions. First principle thinking doesn't reject established practices. That's not what it's all about. It interrogates their relevance and it ruthlessly eliminates what no longer makes sense because every hour spent creating and maintaining the wrong thing is time not spent delivering real value. Now let's go deeper. Identifying and challenging assumptions. Every system we're working layers assumption upon assumption until we can't see the foundation anymore. These assumptions become invisible constraints that limit our thinking. I call this inherited complexity, the accumulation of decisions made by people who aren't here anymore, solving problems they may not exist today. It's like sedimentary rock. Each layer made sense when it formed, and together they create friction and resistance. However, we don't just blow it up. If you haven't already, watch the video that I made before on the fallacy of Chesterton's fence. In short, don't change what you don't understand. If you can't explain it, don't touch it yet. This is where the five whys on steroids comes in. Don't just ask why something exists. Ask why we believe it must exist. And what value does this actually provide? There's always a difference. Financial services team I worked with couldn't deploy during business hours. Weekend releases were the standard. Everyone hated it, including the customers. We mapped it. We can't deploy during business hours. Why not? Because deployments cause downtime. Why do they cause downtime? Because we have to restart the application. This is when engineers start looking at me really weird, like, do you even know how software works? What? We kept going. Why do we restart the application? Because that's how deployment works. Well, why does it work that way? Because that's how it's always worked. Frustrated. Right? That's the bedrock. That's when first principles thinkings begin. So we asked, what would zero downtime deployments require? They listed load balancing, graceful shutdowns, backward compatibility, all solvable. The real blocker wasn't technical. It was the assumption that service downtime was inevitable. 6 months later, they were deploying during business hours the moment features were ready. Customers were delighted, and so were the teams. Let's try this together. Think of a constraint your team is facing. Now ask yourself, is this constraint physical or policy based? Who decided this constraint exists? What problem was it originally solving? Does that problem still exist? And if we remove the constraint, what would actually break? You'll often find that policy is masquerading as physical boulders that are impossible to move. This connects directly to systems thinking. When you take a high altitude view of the system, the components, the interactions, the feedback loops, you start to see the assumptions underneath. I worked with a publishing group that couldn't release content without 3 layers of approval. Weeks passed, everyone hated it. So we asked, what are approvals meant to achieve? The answer was simple to them: quality and brand consistency. So, do 3 levels do that better than one? The data said no. Most edits happened at the first level. The rest, they were rubber stamps from calendars too busy to even skim the document. That's what was causing the delays. They shifted to clear content guidelines and single level approval. Quality stayed constant. Speed jumped tenfold. The blocker wasn't legal, it was trust. Here's where we bring it all together. Applying first principles thinking across entire systems, not just isolated processes. Systems thinking helps us see flow and interconnection between the intervening parts of the system. First principles thinking challenges whether those connections should exist at all. Mm, Let's get real. We can't question everything at once, and it would be dangerous and confusing if you tried. Instead, focus on leverage points, small shifts that reveal large opportunities. An e-commerce team I coached was battling performance issues. Their architecture had service dependencies stacked like dominoes. They optimized individual pieces for months with minimal gains. So we asked, what's the minimum path to complete purchase? Well, simple. Authenticate, check inventory, process payment, create order. 4 steps. The actual implementation, 24 services. Many copied from patterns at bigger companies just in case. Turning to first principles, they collapsed it to 7 essential services. Performance improved, debugging became easier, iteration got faster. This is where first principles and lean converge. Every extra step, every extra step, wrapper, or redundancy, they all introduce waste. First principles thinking helps you identify which complexities serve real value and which exists through habit. One team I worked with had over 200 permission combinations in their user model. The data showed that 96% of users used three. The rest, they were rare edge cases that could be handled manually. Focusing on what users actually needed gave them a simpler, more maintainable system. And you can always make it better as you identify leverage points that will increase the value of your products and services to your customers. So, how do you spot those leverage points? Look at the most expensive parts in your system in time, effort, and coordination. Identify recurring failures, often symptoms of flawed assumptions. Watch for slow feedback loops, signs of overcomplexity or unnecessary gatekeeping. You're not questioning everything. You're questioning what the data points to. That's empiricism and scientific method in action, not some belief or cult based group thing that could be dangerous. Well, let's bring it home. First, build psychological safety. If people fear consequences for asking why, first principle thinking is not going to happen. Then introduce assumption hunting. These tensions, for example, you can do them once in every iteration. And what you can do to set them up is pick one frustrating policy. Then start asking questions around it. Why do we need this? Who decided it? What problem does it solve? Does that problem still exist? And what would happen if we stopped doing it? Start small. It builds trust and momentum. There are some ways, some fun ways that you can implement this. They're like a kind of games, and they're good to help introduce the concepts to teams. So, for example, you can have the alien anthropologist. Just imagine from a perspective of an alien landing on Earth, and they're an anthropologist. They're stumbling upon things, and they all of a sudden they hit upon your process. They don't have any of your context. What would confuse somebody from that perspective? The answer to that question points to where you need to start digging. Another way that you can introduce this is, what if we were a startup? If you had no baggage, how would you solve this today? The difference reveals your assumption load. Or another approach is explain it to a 5-year-old. Describe your process in simple terms. If you hit, well, that's just how we do it. You've hit an assumption. And very important, nothing is sacred. One common myth is that regulators tell you how to comply. They don't. They tell you what outcomes to meet. How you meet them is up to you. The flexibility is your opportunity to build compliance in ways that actually support your environments. Yes, you need to be HIPAA compliant. No, you don't need extra documentation. That tags to what you already use and generate reports that show you're actively monitoring, not just checking a box. Regulators love that because they know it's real. It's not just made up for them, for their eyes only. When you embark in the first principles thinking journey, watch for these straps to keep you safe. Paralysis from overanalysis, discarding hard won lessons, breaking stability without a recovery plan, making others feel blamed for past decisions. Reframe it as evolution, not critique. This made sense then. Does it still make sense now? Third question. Small wins compound. One team I worked with went from we can't possibly do continuous deployment to true continuous delivery by tackling one assumption at a time. So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this. First principles thinking isn't just a problem solving technique. It's a mindset that keeps us honest about why we do what we do, prevents us from optimizing dysfunction. It helps us build systems that serve real needs, not imagined ones. So, how can you get started? Ask your teams to identify one frustrating process or policy. Carve out 30 minutes this week and trace it back with your team. Ask why it exists, who benefits, what assumptions support it, what would happen if you let it go. Once you have a plan with your, that you figured out your next steps, share that with us. We'd love to hear it. And if you'd like to know more about continuous improvement and Kaizen, click one of these. I'll be happy to tell you all about it.